I had heard stories about the escaped mental patient and its machete all through my childhood. Growing up within 100 miles of the Western State Hospital, you couldn't help hearing the stories. Even living on a farm, surrounded by the densest of the West Virginia woods, even if we hadn't heard things from school, our parents would have told us such tales around Halloween. They liked to see us jump in the firelight at the sound of crunching leaves or a snapping twig. So when I was 14, knowing that my little brother had heard the same stories, I decided to scare him the way I had been scared a few years earlier. I got an old, dull machete out of the tool shed and smeared some tomato paste across the blade. Then I put on an old Halloween mask that I knew he hadn't seen for several years. My parents were at a Halloween party that night, and the little bit of trick-or-treating that happened among the neighborhood farms had ended by 9 o'clock. Billy had fallen asleep on the sofa, and the TV's bluish light had died out after the local station's sign-off, so the only light falling over my brother was the hazy moonlight spilling through the windows. I crept in from the kitchen and stood behind the sofa for a second. He laid there, sleeping as peacefully as the moon itself. I gave the back of the couch a shake, and Billy jerked awake to see that red, smeared blade hovering over him. He let out a shriek, rolled off onto the floor, and just stayed there, shivering.
Billy? Billy, are you alright? Billy? Billy? Mom? Dad?
A few hours later,
I played
after
a
I'd called my
prank on
parents and
Billy,
told them what I had done, and that Billy hadn't moved for a long time, they came home and found him catatonic on his bed. I had put him there after 10 minutes or so, not knowing what else to do. After some shouting and some frantic and muddled discussion, they admitted they didn't quite know what to do either. He was breathing okay, and there was no sign of physical injury. After a little bit, my dad called the hospital and described Billy's situation to one of the night physicians. The doctor said such symptoms were uncommon after a severe fright, and Billy probably wouldn't come around by morning. He didn't. A few days later, after whatever testing they could do at the Weston Mental Hospital, a state psychologist said Billy's mind had been ready to break, and that if I hadn't scared him, something else would have triggered the breakdown. Everyone said it wasn't my fault my brother became psychotic, but I'm still not so sure my mom and dad don't blame me. Billy stayed in Weston until he turned 18, and then, no matter what the doctors thought, they had to let him go. State law. He roamed around for a while, and sometimes seemed to be getting along okay. The doctors in Weston always said Billy would eventually snap, and sure enough, a few years later after his release, he did. He found his way into several bedrooms in nearby farmhouses, carrying a machete that wasn't too old or dull. That was 17 years ago, and I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with a dream of that bloody blade lingering in my eyes. A day doesn't go by without me thinking of those 12 people Billy sliced up. Some of them with their throats split open, some with guts spilling out of their bellies. Most of them had at least one eye gouged out. I don't know why some people go nuts and leave a trail of blood through the woods, but when my boys were little, I didn't tell them any ghost stories or stories about serial killers or any other garbage like that. And when Jason came home from school crying because he'd heard from another kid about his uncle the psycho, I sat both boys down and gave them the straight facts. I don't think it's hereditary.